everyone, and I call Committee of Supply, Section A, to order. We're meeting today to continue discussion on supplement estimates of the Ministry of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation, and I now recognize the Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Welcome to the Chair. This is regarding vote number 34S, resolved that a sum not exceeding $75 million be granted to His Majesty to defray the expenses of the Ministry of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation, treaty and other agreements funding to March 31st, 2023.
Member for Vancouver-Langara.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate that with the time we have remaining, we can pick up the discussion from yesterday. The Minister, just before we adjourned the committee review, made a response that I'd like to respond to, relating to the Northern First Nations Alliance and their proposal for a detox and wellness center, including a facility in Terrace. Just to clarify, my focus on the Tahltan was, as the Minister points out, currently the Alliance membership includes 4 First Nations, the Gitxsan, Haisla, Nisga'a, and the Tsimshian, representing 9 Indigenous communities. We talked in brief about those communities in the northwest of BC that are involved in terms of the area of coverage for these nations. I will point out, if I had the opportunity yesterday, but I'll say it now, that the feasibility study that the Minister does have a copy of does include the center's this is the Health and Wellness Detox Center to be located in Terrace. It does have a greater scope to it in terms of nations, in particular refers to ensuring that it will reinforce the cultural protocols of the Tsimshian, the Nisga'a, Haisla, Gitxsan, Wet'suwet'en, Haida, and the Tahltan. As I understand it from the Health and Wellness Committee of the Northern First Nations Alliance, they have had discussions with the Tahltan Nation and that they're showing significant interest in being involved. In fact, there has been ongoing discussions as well with the Kaska and the Taku River Tlingit, the other 2 members of the Three Nations Society that's the subject matter, Mr. Speaker, of the 5th agreement that we've been reviewing here, which is the Three Nations BC Regional Partnership Agreement. And I believe, Mr. Chair, that the reason for that, of course, for the other involvements is the greater understanding of the need in the Northwest, which is connected to all of these nations. And so we do have an opportunity where the nations are coming together to focus on the need for a health and wellness and a detox center here to be located in Terrace, which is accessible to all the northern communities. And so in working with partnership with municipalities and Northern Health and the MFHA, as the Minister did cite, FNHA, the First Nations Health Authority, did provide the funding, $100,000, to fund the feasibility study, which has copies of which have been provided also to the Premier and the Minister for Mental Health and Addiction Recovery as well. I wanted to just take this opportunity, though, and before I just ask the Minister to respond to that clarification in terms of the involvements of the other nations, just to read into the record, I did receive a communication from the co-chair of the Health and Wellness Committee, Linda Morvan. And she sent a personal note, and I just think under the circumstances, recognizing the focus that we all have in this chamber on the importance of mental wellness and addiction recovery, she says, I strongly believe that we need to stress the significance of the need for the Detox and Wellness Center in Northern BC. She speaks from her personal experience. We lost one of our granddaughters in December from an overdose and lost another granddaughter this month from an overdose. Both are in their early 20s, and both of them wanted to live and get well. One of them left 2 children, and she sent me photos of the children, which are very cute. Both strived to get well and couldn't begin due to the lack of resources in the northern BC in our area. They waited like many of our loved ones who waited, and time definitely was not on their side. Yes, this is personal for me. It's personal for all of us and our families and communities who have lost loved ones, due to addictions. We are losing many family members. The system is failing us. We can't lose another family member to this crisis. I am so scared for another one of our granddaughters who is addicted to heroin and has been for a number of years. The good news is that she took it upon herself to get clean and has been for over 4 months. She detoxed on her own and lives in Terrace, BC, which is where this regional center is to be located, but won't go to treatment as she doesn't want to leave her daughter. I'm so proud of her, but I'm also so scared for her. She needs treatment. We need detox and treatment in our area. How many more of our loved ones are going to lose their lives before our province helps us? We're their voice, and we need this heard and supported by BC. Thank you again, and I hope and pray our project is funded. This project being the proposal by the Northern First Nations Alliance for this Detox and Wellness Center in Northwest BC. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for allowing me the opportunity to read that, because I do think her ending statement is important. When we talk about hearing voices from First Nation leaders, that's what we pay respect to in this House, and thank you for giving me that opportunity to read it into the House. I know the Minister understands the need. I know that. I know that he recognizes the importance of this feasibility study. He commented on that yesterday. But let me just stop there, and I'll just give the Minister an opportunity to respond, and I do have a follow-on question relating to how this fits with the Three Nations BC Regional Partnership Agreement.
Minister of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation.
Well, thank you very much. And before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge again that we are conducting this work on the territory of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, the Songhees and Esquimalt nations. And I just want to respond, if I may, through you to the member for his advocacy and his compassion for what Linda Morvan shared with him, and now through to the legislature through his reading into the record. The tragedy of the loss of her 2 grandchildren is unimaginable, and so we obviously empathize on this side of the House, as I know the member does as well, with that terrible loss. We also are pleased that the member pointed out that their discussions are underway with the Tahltan, who aren't part of the existing, the Tahltan nations, and indeed he mentioned the Taku River Tlingit, I believe, and the Casca interests. I am pleased to have had an opportunity to review the feasibility study last night, and it indeed is an extraordinarily powerful piece of work, well regarded by those who look at these studies, I'm told. I'm pleased that the First Nation Health Authority saw fit to provide funding to create such a powerful document, such a thoughtful and thorough document. And of course, I'll be working with my colleagues in other ministries and indeed with the Indigenous Services Canada Department to see whether some of the things that are sought and so urgently needed can be created. I think I'll leave it at that point because I believe the member has a subsequent question.
Member.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate the minister's response and his care and attention to look at the feasibility study again, and I agree with him. The work that was done to put that together by Manon, Joyce, and others with the Health and Wellness Committee, members of which I read into the record yesterday, with Linda, is remarkable in terms to try and pull all these aspects together. So in the context of the challenge, of course, and the minister commented on that. We are talking about the continued need to support remote Indigenous communities, some of whom have greater opportunities, let's say, to move forward with economic reconciliation, but some of them that do not. And I think the nations working together can hopefully support each other to increase the access to much needed mental health and addiction recovery type facilities like the ones proposed in Terrace. My question through you, Mr. Chair, is back to this fifth agreement that we're looking at, and I do appreciate the minister's second part of his response in terms of potential next steps as to the discussions that he is willing, let's say, to take up with his colleagues and to look at his federal counterparts as well for this important project. Recognizing, though, Mr. Chair, of course, that under this supplemental estimates process, the accelerated payment under this fifth agreement, the $10.99 million that is being accelerated from 4 years to this year, in effect, under this agreement. My point that I was making yesterday, and I asked the minister to consider this a little further in response, we have a situation where this government has determined that there is a surplus and has made certain decisions with the minister's input here and his team to put $75 million towards accelerated payments under 6 agreements. This fifth agreement, though, as I was trying to work through yesterday with the minister, includes references to supporting wellness for the communities and emerging social priorities. So I believe, and when I look at this agreement, that the important work that the 3 nations are doing, the Tahltan, the Casca, and Taku River Tlingit, are all moving in the same direction. So, and I appreciate there are other nations and other communities, municipalities, Terrace itself. We had the mayor of Terrace here last week, the new mayor, talking about the importance of the Resource Benefits Alliance as well, the RBA arrangement. There's lots of need, of course. And as we look at the First Nations role that they play in leading in areas, and there's a certain amount of coordination that is necessary here. So in the face of all of this, in the face of the fact that the government did receive this feasibility study back in November or earlier, and did write back to this Health and Wellness Committee about going to First Nations Health Authority, does the minister not see a path here for this proposal to work together with these nations as it looks further about its own strategic path that's being reported on, recognizing the agreement was only entered into, and I'm sure there was work leading into it, in September 2022. But I'm suggesting, Mr. Chair, that there is combined efforts going in the same direction, an area of great need, an emerging social priority, to say the least. Linda's words are important. It's more than emerging, and we all know this. It's generational, especially with Indigenous peoples and their children, their daughters, their granddaughters, as Linda underscored. So my suggestion to the minister is there not a path, my question and suggestion to the minister, is there not a path under this agreement for the Northern First Nations Alliance to come together with these three First Nations under their partnership regional agreement to find a path? And perhaps what I'm obviously looking at is access to some, if not a good portion, of that funding that this government is making available on an accelerated basis to meet a need that is clearly more than emerging.
Minister.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I want to just start by agreeing with the member about the power of nations coming together. That is what he refers to in the context of the Northern First Nations Alliance, but also, of course, the Three Nations agreement that we're talking about is the product of three nations, the Taltasca, Taku River, Tlingit, coming together. And it's that which we really welcome and support. And therefore, under the agreement that's at issue, there is, as I mentioned yesterday, a strategic pathways work plan in which the nations will be determining their priorities. And I'm sure that these discussions are underway. And the opportunities will be there to assess and discuss many of these projects, perhaps including the one that's before us. It's for the three nations in application of that work plan where resolution of this issue may occur. But I wouldn't want to be seen as suggesting that we have that it is for us to do so. This is, as it says in it, the very title of the agreement, this is a regional partnership agreement with the three nations and the province of British Columbia.
Member.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate the time that the minister has taken in this process to address this particular project. It's an important one, but it's only one important project in the province, of course, to some nations. I wanted to come back, though, Mr. Chair. Yesterday we were talking at length about the process in terms of the determination of the allocation of a surplus by this government to these particular nations themselves. So I wanted to talk through some of those points as to how this came together. So let me ask you first through yourself, Mr. Chair, to the minister. In terms of these 6 accelerated payments under these 6 agreements, were any of these accelerated payments, any of the 6, and in which case, which ones, were reviewed or approved by Treasury Board?
Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I can confirm for the member that indeed all 6 of the agreements at issue were the subject of Treasury Board approval.
Member.
I appreciate the response, Mr. Chair. I'm referring to the the decision to accelerate the payments, which is a new $75 million expenditure under each of these 6 agreements in total. That's what I'm referring to, was the accelerated payments themselves, not just the agreements reviewed and approved by Treasury Board.
Minister.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair. And of course, we had extensive discussion of this very question yesterday, and I'll try to do my best to say what I said yesterday, perhaps in different terms. This ministry and others were asked to identify items for supplementary estimates based on government priorities. The Premier made it clear that the government would seek to use the 2022-2023 revenue improvement to help British Columbians as opportunities became available. Therefore, this ministry identified, as I indicated yesterday, candidates where that could be done, namely the accelerated payments under existing agreements. and that was the process that was followed. I'll defer the question about the supplementary supply process to the Minister of Finance.
Member.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And when I hear that response to the minister and in the background of the previous responses he gave yesterday on similar questions, I didn't hear an answer directly back about Treasury Board approval process, but I'll take that as not addressing it, and presumably the minister would say, well, take it up with the Minister of Finance. So we'll just park that, and I'm sure my colleague, the Shadow Minister for Finance, will have that opportunity, maybe even as early as his review on other matters this afternoon. I hear the minister when the minister speaks, Mr. Chair, about government priorities, but of course, as we know, under UNDRIP and the relationship that we continue to try and forge and move forward in this province around reconciliation, that we need to hear from First Nations as well, nation to nation. And that the nation to nation priorities that are expressed under the overall framework, including the DRIPA action plan, and the other alternatives and other priorities, let's say, that we collectively need to have in this province. So with that in mind, and with that in view in mind, I'd like to ask, through you, Mr. Chair, to the minister, were there other priorities of this ministry that were considered as alternatives to accelerated payments under 6 existing agreements? What I'm referring to is this. The minister did take us through yesterday the agreement process and how these 6 agreements fit within the criteria that the minister spelled out. But just stepping back from that, when the Minister of Finance and the Premier came to this ministry to ask for those priorities to be reflected in the expenditure of a surplus, were there other ministry priorities, recognizing what I said about First Nations, considered as an alternative to accelerating payments to select chosen First Nations?
Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I can answer the member through you as follows, that this, of course, is the limited scope of the supplementary estimates process that's before us. And in that narrow compass, we concluded that the priorities for these nations reflected in these agreements was where this ministry wished to provide the limited funding available, the circumscribed process before us and supplementary estimates. I put it in that context because, of course, we will have ample opportunity through the main estimates process coming up later this year to go through the entire array of priorities and serious issues that face our ministry at any given time as we work toward reconciliation on so many fronts with the 203 nations of our First Nations in our province and, of course, Métis Nation BC as well. So I think I'd frame the answer in that way.
Member.
Mr. Chair, I'm conscious that we're getting close here in terms of the timing, but let me just say this, that to be clear, certainly as members of this House and members of the official opposition, all members respect the nations for whom are entered into these agreements. And we talked yesterday about the work that was done in the previous BC Liberal government with the Chislada Carrier nations, for example. That's one of the 6 agreements. And we obviously recognize and respect the importance of that work. But I have to say, Mr. Chair, that in successive rounds of questioning through yesterday and this morning, there's a real lack of clarity and transparency as to the government's process. We have what's remarkable that the Minister of Finance would come to this minister and say, with no limits, no allocation, what do you want to spend money on? And so that does invite a question as to all the other pressing priorities of government, nation to nation, with the nations in our province. It's been 3.5 years since UNDRIP was adopted. And the member from Saanich North and the Islands yesterday highlighted, one, there's many important leaders in our province. They all are. But Kasalem of the Squamish First Nation, in talking publicly in response to this budget, talking about the importance of capacity funding under Section 3 of the DRIPA Act, the overload that government is presenting to nations, that is clearly a priority of government, if not of the nations themselves. I talked about the Northern First Nations Alliance, and the minister has responded in a good way, in the way he's able to in the confines of supplementary estimates, as he points out. I understand that. But there are clearly other priorities that this government could have, should have, maybe they did consider and dismissed. They came to 6 agreements, which are obligated by this government, this province. They're legal agreements that have funding requirements to them. And this government has decided to accelerate the payments. And I appreciate, again, for example, in the case of Chislada Carrier Nation, that it's long overdue through successive governments. I understand that. But we have choices that this government is making. And I'm not getting any clarity from this minister or this government as to the manner in which they made these choices. This causes me a lot of concern. When we talk about ensuring that there are results and outcomes for how government expends taxpayer dollars, when we talk about the reporting and accountability measures that are set out in this 5th agreement, measures that have not yet been tested. I appreciate again the reputation that the minister cited of the chiefs, the 3 chiefs, and I have respect for them as well, certainly. But we haven't seen anything come back in terms of the report. $5 million has gone, in round numbers, has gone out through that 3 Nations Society agreement. Now we're talking about another $10.9 million going out. We've had no reporting, as far as I can determine, accounting and coming back. So when I ask questions about what's the identification of emerging priorities under that important work, it's not yet there. And yet the government is choosing to accelerate 4 years of payments in 1 year, with not even getting our progress report back, because it's not called for in the agreement yet. We haven't gone through the full fiscal year. I understand that by the terms of the agreement. But surely this government would ask for a report prior to spending more dollars, because we know the need is so great for Indigenous nations and First Nations, including Métis Nation BC. So I have real difficulty with this process, what's been presented. We were presented 6 agreements without any notice. We did have some support in getting copies of these agreements. We are not having the time to turn to the 6th agreement, the Get Now agreement, because it's confidential. I understand that in the minister's response yesterday. But it's very difficult to talk about acceleration of payment terms under an agreement that I've not seen, that this government has not been in position to share. Even when we're talking about the Chislada Carrier Nation, when the minister yesterday turned me to the website, A to Z, there's many agreements, of course, under C for Chislada Carrier. And the agreement that, the third agreement that had the payment obligations wasn't even on the website, meaning we were going around a bit, let's just say, in fairness to me and the role that I can play in terms of how can I address properly the payment obligations that this government has under that agreement that has been accelerated under the supplemental estimates. So I'm very concerned as the message that this government is sending through this minister to the other nations. So let me ask through you, Mr. Chair, to this minister who I respect, is what is the message to the other First Nations that were not included in the accelerated payments under these 6 agreements? What is the message that this minister and this government expects them to be receiving from this supplemental estimate submission? And secondly, were any First Nations invited to be considered when this government determined that there was a surplus? Did they invite any First Nations to submit and request funding? We know there was a feasibility study on the table of this government for the Northern First Nations Alliance. But I know there's so many other worthwhile and meaningful and important projects, apart from capacity funding. We know there's great challenge out there. So was there not any other First Nations, AFMBC, First Nations Leadership Summit? I was up there last 10 days ago. The Minister for Water, Land, and Resource Stewardship spoke at that conference in person, talked about the challenges of consulting, insurance consulting, about the Emergency Programs Act that's coming forward and the Mineral Tenure Act review. These are important considerations of legislation that we're hearing are coming from this government and we have not yet seen. There is certainly needs to support First Nations as they address and consider those important pieces of land-based legislation, which is the point that the minister made, the Minister for Water, Land, and Resource Stewardship. So again, through you, Mr. Chair, to the minister, what message is this minister and this government sending to those other First Nations on these important projects and important needs for funding for surplus, if this is what the government wants to call it, that's making available? Why did they choose these particular nations to do this, political or otherwise? And were other nations invited to submit for access to the surplus funding?
Minister.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate the question from my colleague. I think he, with great respect, and I have enormous respect for the member, we've endeavored over 4 hours yesterday and today to draw the line, as we must, between the supplementary estimates process, which is before us, and of course the opportunity that the member will have to talk about the general budget of our ministry. If the $75 million at issue today were to be approved by the legislature, our budget will be over $250 million. And Mr. Chair, I'm sure you would realize that the number of priorities facing a Ministry of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation in the 21st century, it's just an enormous list. And the member's listed 2 or 3 priorities that he believes are important, and I would agree with those priorities. But there are so many more. It was our process, and the member may not like the process. I've tried my best to articulate it on at least 3 occasions, describing how the Minister of Finance and our ministry and all ministries work together to deal with an unprecedented surplus situation. And we were asked to identify things that we thought in the circumscribed time frame available could make a real difference to nations. And we chose the priorities. A choice was indeed made because we applied the criteria, which I can read again into the record. I think a criteria that the member does not seem to quarrel with, that would allow us to advance, make progress in areas where First Nations have agreements underway and could, by advancing the funding, could make even better progress, more accelerated progress, because that's what we're doing. Now, specifically in the context of the Three Nations Agreement, I explained to the member, I think he acknowledges, that that was signed in September of last year. It would be unreasonable to think we would have, I think he used the term, progress reports at this point. We are now in March. We haven't had a progress report to date. We believe, however, based on the leadership of the chiefs that I named yesterday and the work that we're doing on the ground, that our relationship will allow those the important priorities that the Three Nations Regional Partnership Agreement is designed to address, that enormous progress will be made going forward, and that is why we were comfortable applying that of one of the 6 before us today. I'm happy to speak again about the each and every one of those agreements, but I think I cannot do any more than repeat what I've said earlier about the nature, the sort of unusual process that we're in today, dealing with supplementary estimates as distinct from the main estimates process, in which we can address all the priorities and many more that the member has addressed.
Minister, I'll ask you to move the motion. Rise and
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I move the committee rise, report progress, and ask leave to sit again.
members, you've heard the question. All those in favor, say aye. Anyone opposed, say nay. This motion carried, and this committee stands adjourned. Thank you.